Hello class. In lieu of today's lecture, I am providing you a recording of the last material that we had to cover in the course, and that is on labor markets, price discrimination, and a little bit of a wrap-up related to indifference curves as it pertains to our utility lecture. So if you remember back to the budget constraint that we drew in last class, we had, well, if my PowerPoint allows me to, basically we had a budget constraint here where we had a good X and a good Y, and then based on the prices of X and the prices of Y and the amount of income that we had, there was a budget in which we could attain. If you think back to the cost lecture where we had these things called isoquants, which are parallel curves that indicate the constant level of quantity that could be produced with a given set of inputs, although that cost will vary. The same is true for utility. Basically, if we look at the graph at the top right corner of your screen, the blue curve indicates a certain level of utility. We'll call it 25. So at any point along that blue line, we're getting 25 units of happiness. Now, the varying locations of the indifference curve indicate that there are different bundles of a good X and good Y that we could pay for to get that same level of utility. Now notice we could get 25 units of utility here, but we could also pay our entire budget in two different locations, or even pay more than our budget to get that same level of utility. If we look at I4, let's say it's 75 units of happiness. We aren't actually able to get to any point along that red indifference curve because of the fact that we're stuck on our given budget constraint. And as a result, it's unattainable like it would be with a production possibilities frontier or an ISO cost, or now in this case, a budget constraint. Now the ideal situation, let's say it's at 50 units of satisfaction, is to find a point in which the indifference curve is tangent to the budget constraint. So what does tangent mean? Tangent basically means that you are touching it at one location but nowhere else. What that basically means is that there's no possible combination of 50 units of satisfaction that you could achieve without spending more than your total budget. But at your exact budget, you are capable of consuming a combination of X and Y that gives you that level of happiness, which means it's the best that you can do, because plausibly, again, these are parallel, so that means that at no point will these curves touch each other. So if there's a indifference curve that is corresponding with 51 units of happiness, at no point will it touch the budget constraint. It'll be too expensive. Furthermore, if we had, say, I don't know, a purple curve, I'm probably going to do this poorly, but I'm going to try to draw it. So let's say that corresponds with, I don't know, 48 units of happiness. Notice that we can get more happiness by being on the green curve, and subsequently we could also spend our entire budget at two different locations to get that same 48 units of happiness. So this is another way where we could take the information that we've calculated with our budget constraints and our utility maximization graphs, and you can actually derive something like this. So in our example, we had basketball games and concerts. So if on one axis we have concerts and on the other one we have basketball games, I think our budget constraint was 17, and then these were $4, and then these were $5. And so if you only went to basketball games, if you take 17 over 5, that would basically put you at 3.4 basketball games that you could go to within your $17. And then if we take 17 over 4, you could go to 4.25 concerts. Now we don't let you go to a whole concert or a fraction of a concert pay for the whole thing to go to it, but just for the sake of completeness, and we do that. Now, we determined in our previous example that the optimal would be at 3 concerts and 1 basketball game, which means that the indifference curve that is optimizing in that example is going to touch right here and nowhere else. And so I think the total utility was 53 or something like that. So basically that is how you would be able to derive and graph it from the example that we did in class previously. So moving forward, I wanted to talk about labor markets. Labor markets are pretty interesting. There's a bunch of different things that we can get into, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to kind of go over a small slice and snippet of it. But if we had more time and under different circumstances, there's a lot we could dig into. We could dig into discrimination. We could dig into minimum wage. We could dig into monopsony power and framing and a bunch of different things. So what I'm going to do is, if you want to, I'm going to upload a subsequent slide deck. It doesn't have an over-recorded lecture for it. But if you decide that you want to look into this information a little bit further, particularly in the context of minimum wage, I have a separate presentation that I can share with the class. And if you want to read into it, you can. But if you don't want to, that's okay, because it won't be tested. But anyways, one of the ways in which consumers kind of help dictate what their budget constraint in a given period of time is going to be is they're going to generate their own sentiment of labor supply. So basically, how much labor you supply, how many skills you have, which expands or contracts the amount of job opportunities you may have and the wage levels that you may be able to achieve. The amount of demand in a market for labor, which we'll get to in a second, may dictate how many hours are available to work. But the reason why I want to show you this weird looking curve here is because the labor supply curve has a backwards bend to it. It's upward sloping like a traditional supply curve for the most part. But after a certain point, it kind of starts to bend backwards. And the reason why is because built into the labor supply curve and the labor supply model is we don't necessarily have a linear relationship between wages and labor supply. Part of the reason for that is because when we are working, we're sacrificing leisure, which is time to relax, time to sleep, time to enjoy things. So all the things that we talked about in terms of what we want to buy in terms of consumption of goods and services, we lose that opportunity now because of the fact that we're working instead. We aren't able to consume goods and services that we can derive utility from because we're working instead. So there's a disutility with working, like a negative level of satisfaction that we get by working. And eventually, if your wage rate is so high, it doesn't make sense for you to actually be working more. It actually would make sense for you to work less. So part of the reason why I'm in the job that I'm at is when I was growing up, I started minimum wage at about $5.50 an hour. And even when I got out of law school, I was still stocking groceries and delivering pizzas for a little while just because I couldn't find a stable job, whether it was in teaching or law or contracts or working for the city or anything like that. Getting rejected by everything. I was even getting rejected by fast food places and retail stores. But I got a couple opportunities about 2 months into my job search, and I was making, with tips delivering pizzas, I don't know, $13, $14 an hour. But I was working a ton of hours to achieve that. So yeah, I was able to survive on it and pay for rent and be able to afford a new car with it. Newer car, not a new car. But I kind of reached a pivotal moment where I realized, oh, well, I have to decide between, I mean, I went to school all this time. I accumulated a bunch of student loan debt, which was another issue in of itself, but also like stability and security for my future. Like I'd went to school for all this stuff, and yeah, I was comfortable working kind of low wage or entry level jobs in food service retail because that's just kind of how I grinded my way through school and through my teenage years. But I kind of decided, um, how do people accumulate wealth and how do people kind of enjoy their lives? And what I started to realize is that I started valuing my time a lot more than the money. And so I started realizing, you know what, there's certain jobs that I could do or strive for that would pay a lot of money, but I don't need a lot of money. I need a lot of time because um, people in my family haven't been able to travel a lot. They haven't had the freedom to be able to do the things they want to do, and they didn't have the financial freedom to do it either. And so that was what I started striving for. And so once I reached a certain threshold in terms of income and a career choice in terms of education that allowed for me to have more free time than I would have in a traditional 9 to 5. You work 48 to 50 weeks a year. You have the same days off. I mean, in education, we kind of are stuck to our set schedule during the regular school year, but then you have 3 to 4 months off where you can kind of just reset, decompress, explore the world, and do things like that. And so, yeah, I can earn some money during that time, but I don't earn as much as I would during the regular school year. But I'm fine with that because over the course of my career, I'm going to have an extra 6 years of freedom to do the things that I want to do, to spend time with my family, to explore the world and do things like that that I otherwise wouldn't have had if I would have just kind of went into law, worked 80 to 100 hours a week, and yeah, I have $200,000 a year, but like I can't spend it on anything, and then I burn myself out, and then I waste it on healthcare, and I waste it on missed opportunities, and so um, that backwards bend is basically representing that you start substituting the value of your time higher than the value of the additional income that you earn. Now, some people will keep going up and up and up because they want to get as much money as possible as quickly as possible, or they've got other reasons that require them to make as much money as possible. But at a certain point, you start realizing I don't need to work 100 hours a week if I'm making $400 an hour. I can work 30 hours a week when I'm making $400 an hour. I can work 20 hours a week making $500 an hour. I'm going to make way more than someone who's working 60 hours a week at even like a job that pays $20 an hour. And so the reason why we theoretically assume that a labor supply curve has a backwards bend to it is because eventually, whether it's because of life circumstances, level of money, health, etc., you start valuing your time more than you value um, the money. And so a lot of people that are like really wealthy or celebrities or things like that, that's actually kind of what they value the most too, is because like when you have $100 million, what does that extra money going to do for you to get you kind of excited about something? What you want is your flexibility and your freedom. Now, when I jump into talking about labor demand, which isn't visualized here, but I'm going to show you the graph of labor supply and labor demand in a second. When we look at it from the perspective of how many people get hired in a particular industry or what is the right minimum wage or something like that, from the demand perspective, because now we're basically in the factor market instead of the product market where you're used to being consumers and the firm is the supplier. The roles have been reversed. You are being compensated. You're providing the supply for the market. The firm is hiring you because they need you in terms of demand to produce their goods and services so they can end up selling them and actually making any sort of money. So the way in which we evaluate how much a firm is willing and able to hire in terms of a specific market is by using what's known as the marginal revenue product of labor. So that's a long term. Basically, marginal again means additional. Revenue means money that they're bringing in. Product basically just means how many units are being produced, and then of labor means based on hiring an additional worker. So all of that kind of helps define it, but basically what it means is it's the additional revenue a firm receives from hiring one additional worker. So basically, hiring a new worker, they're going to get a certain level of output or sales from them. What is the total value in terms of revenue of those sales? And a firm will hire that worker if the amount of revenue they generate exceeds how much they're paying them. So in reality, there's an incentive for a worker to do as little work for as much money as possible, and then for a employer, it's to do as much work for as little as possible, so that way they can maximize their gains. Now, there's a lot of efficiency versus equity questions in terms of where does the firm profit from. Labor costs and those types of things tend to be the most expensive form of producing a good or service, and thus firms tend to look there first in terms of saving money to maximize profits, to make shareholders happy, because that's the way the incentives are generated. I'm not saying it's right, I'm just saying that's the way the things are. So right now we're kind of in a reckoning or a dilemma situation where we're realizing that we've kind of squeezed as much money out of people as possible. And now there's kind of a point where costs are getting high in terms of main living expenses like housing and education and healthcare. And so people want more money, and they, in most cases, deserve more money. But the theory suggests that a firm only hire a worker if they generate as much or more revenue than their salary or their wages. So if I am being paid, I don't know, $60,000 a year, and I generate only $40,000 in tuition revenue, then I'm probably a drain on the overall budget of the college. But if I make $60,000 a year and I generate about $110,000 worth of tuition revenue, then I'm a heck of a deal. And then in the next union negotiations, we go and say, hey, look, like, you're getting an extra 50 grand out of me. I want some of that cut, because if not, then I can go to another institution and make more money or something like that. And so there's this song and dance that's happening where people are just trying to figure out where is kind of that equilibrium. So a firm will hire until that last worker is basically equal to the amount of revenue that they're generating. So I think most people that are working for somebody else are cognizant of the fact that there needs to be some sort of benefit to the company beyond hiring workers and boosting the general amount of jobs and employment in the economy. Like, that's great and all, but like, if the business is gonna not be profitable, then there's zero incentive for the firm to actually go forward with the plan as it is. So I think most of us are cognizant of the fact that we want our business to be healthy in terms of, so that way our job is there, but we also don't want to get ripped off either. So this turns my attention to what the traditional labor market looks like. So we as the labor suppliers are now the supply curve, upward sloping red curve there. Labor demand is now the firms, the downward sloping labor demand right there. And the blue curve basically corresponds to MRPL, which stands for the marginal revenue product of labor. Basically, the firm's willingness and ability is based on how much money you're going to generate to the company. And then the labor supply curve is based on your own personal preferences for goods and services, and how much you think you need and how much you think you want that you need, or want and need, so that way you can buy as many goods and services that you feel like you need or want in life and maximize your overall satisfaction. Now, this is just kind of a general market for general labor, so there's really no specific sector. Is this for nurses? Is this for doctors? Is this for lawyers? Is this for fast food workers, retail workers? They're all actually going to have their own separate markets. We're in microeconomics, that should make sense. But where things may differ is again in how many people exist that are qualified to do the job in the market, coupled with how much revenue that person is going to generate working at that position. So the answer may be different for a bunch of different industries. And so theoretically, if there's kind of a fair level of negotiation and a fair level of information being shared between the two parties, we theoretically would end up here. And then basically the equilibrium wage rate W star is going to be how much people are paid on average. And then this is the number of people that are going to be hired, Q star. Now, what is that number? Well, it's going to depend on the industry. And the problem is that most companies are private, and most companies don't want to publicly disclose how much their employees are worth, because that is a form of leverage, a form of asymmetric information that allows for employees to potentially have a, I don't want to say unfair, but it seems unfair, regardless, an advantage over the employee in terms of negotiating how much pay they get and how much compensation they receive. So this is why there's a long discussion about raising the minimum wage in terms of it needs to be higher than whatever it is. So in Michigan, it's $9.40. In Ohio, it's $8.80. And I think 15 to 20 states is still the federal minimum of $7.25. So some states actually have it lower or no minimum wage, but because of the Fair Labor Standards Act, they're required to pay the $7.25 minimum wage, notwithstanding tipped employees. So there's a lot of difference and differentials between sectors. And so most people that are against minimum wage usually give you this argument, because minimum wage is what's known as a price floor. We talked about price floors before. So if the price floor is below equilibrium, it technically shouldn't matter, because basically the market forces will push towards the actual minimum wage. So let's say this is $12 and minimum wage is $7.25. It shouldn't really matter. But unfortunately, because of framing issues and things like that, there are a lot of people that get convinced and feel like they're forced to take this $7.25 an hour or $8 an hour, $9 an hour, whatever the minimum wage in the corresponding state that you're in is. The people that are against it will say, well, if you raise the minimum wage to $15, then we have a market failure, because this is the only amount that will actually be supplied, because even though there's more people willing and able to work, there's only this many people willing and able to hire you, because it's too expensive. So we have QF here, and then this distance between here and here is kind of the increase in unemployment as a result of a raised minimum wage above equilibrium. The biggest problem with this theory is not that it's wrong, but the fact is we don't know what equilibrium wage is. We don't know what this is. It's different for every sector, and until the corporations and companies allow for transparent discussions of salaries and allow for them to open their books so people actually know how much they're worth, then it'll just kind of be this song and dance of trying to figure out how much people are actually worth, and it will kind of fight it tooth and nail. And so the theory is correct. There could be an increase in unemployment. But again, as someone who worked in the state house in Wyoming said, a lot of people are working 3 jobs now. So yeah, you might lose some jobs, but if people only have to work one job to meet the requirements of their standard of living that the other 3 jobs combined to do, then a loss of jobs is probably good, and that might open a job up for somebody else. So these are the discussions of minimum wage, and that's kind of how the labor market works. So last but not least, I want to talk about price discrimination. So price discrimination is basically a situation in which you charge different people different prices. Now, most of our graphs and our models in microeconomics and macroeconomics and most economics disciplines or subfields or categories use what's known as the law of one price. And basically, the law of one price it just says that if you charge a price for one person, you have to charge the same price for everybody else. Now, if you go to a grocery store, that tends to be a case unless someone happens to have a coupon. The coupon is actually a form of price discrimination. But let's say there aren't coupons, it's not on sale, there's just a price listed at the local grocery store for $7.99 for something. Well, then you're going to pay $7.99, so is everybody else, assuming that there's enough inventory for everybody. Where things can be different is if there is a form of price discrimination. Maybe it's coupons, maybe it's time, maybe it's because you're buying in bulk, maybe it's because of the way the market is segmented. Whatever the reason, there's also a form of that you can take advantage of that's called arbitrage. So arbitrage is a little bit different than price discrimination in terms of the traditional ways in which we talk about it. Arbitrage is just basically taking something that's in one good, or excuse me, a good or service that's in one market with a lower price and then selling it somewhere else for a higher price. So an example of this would be like there's an international version of a textbook, so it's sold at a lower cost in Indonesia or I don't know, Algeria, and then basically those make their way to the Amazon marketplace, and so the traditional American version of the textbooks being charged by the publisher because of copyright laws at $200, but because of the first sale doctrine, you have a situation where a bunch of people bought or sold the book overseas at like, I don't know, $18. Those people sell it on the Amazon marketplace for like $60, and they make a $42 profit minus shipping, but it's still a substantial difference avoiding paying $200. That's arbitrage. Sometimes arbitrage can be taken advantage of in foreign exchange markets. So maybe you'll convert a dollar to a euro, then a euro to a yen, because the relationship between the euro and the yen is more beneficial than the US dollar to the yen. And so there are ways in which you can take advantage of these things. So a lot of the resale markets on like eBay and stuff are taking advantage of arbitrage. Some of them are also taking advantage of restricted supply and also and taking advantage of perfect price discrimination, which we'll talk about in a second. But overall, arbitrage exists with the kind of influx of new ways of acquiring information. Arbitrage is a little more difficult to achieve, but it can still be done. And it can only occur if there's little to no transactions cost. So like if you were selling that book for $60 and the shipping cost was like $40, well then you're not really making much of a profit there. But again, since you get $140 worth of space, you probably could raise it to 100 and still make a healthy profit margin, even if your shipping costs were that expensive. So what is price discrimination? Like I said, it's just charging different prices to different consumers for the same product. So again, this is different than like supply and demand shifts. Like if demand increases or supply decreases, prices will go up or down at equilibrium because of market forces. But this is directly from the seller being able to kind of segment the market out and basically determine different levels of prices for different groups of people. So there are three types of price discrimination we can talk about. First order or perfect price discrimination is charging a price that is equal to the highest willingness and ability a consumer will pay for each unit of a good or service. So basically what this is saying is if we draw a demand curve the law of one price says, okay, if this is equilibrium, this is how much everybody's going to pay. There's 7 people, all 7 of them are going to pay, I don't know, $5. What perfect price discrimination says instead is that we're going to make person 1 pay this price, person 2 pay this price, person 3 pay this price, person 4, person 5, person 6, person 7 pay the exact price that is their maximum willingness and ability to pay. And what that does is it results in kind of the same efficient market if you had like a supply curve here. But instead of there being like consumer surplus and producer surplus, what ends up happening is all of this becomes producer surplus. Now, a way in which you can achieve first order price discrimination is typically like an eBay auction. So basically, the Nash equilibrium, like we talked about before, in terms of a game theory type situation, the optimal choice there is going to be to make your highest willingness and ability to bid, because if you underbid and you get outbid, well, then you don't get any utility from it. If you overbid, then you lose utility because you're paying more than you wanted. But if you go exactly as much as you want to, at worst, you are at 0, and then at best you get the thing that you wanted. And so that's what's fascinating to me is you can go on eBay and you can see a certain product and you can see how many times it's sold, and you can see how many different prices have been paid for the same product because of segmenting the market, having auctions, having buy it nows to basically help dictate how much someone's willing and able to pay for a good or service, and it's not always the same. Second order price discrimination is based on quantity demanded. So if you go to Sam's Club or Costco or someplace like that, or if you're like a company that is buying in bulk for your materials for your projects, you can get a better deal than your competitors or other people because of the fact that you're buying more of it. Because typically when you buy it in mass, then it's cheaper average cost for the firm. So think about like economies of scale. So economies of scale allow for it to be a charge for the firm to charge a lower price to the consumer. And furthermore, they can charge a lower price to the consumer if the consumer is willing to buy a bunch more. So if you go to Costco or Sam's Club or any other warehouse or bulk store, you can get a better per unit cost as a result of being able to discriminate based on quantity demanded. Third order price discrimination is basically charging a different price based on a certain class of consumer. So if you think about the movie theater, there's like different prices being charged because of the fact that you're coming at a different time of day, or there's a senior discount, or things like that. So third order price discrimination is basically saying that you can charge a different price based on different classes of consumer, based on time of day, or based on the type of person. So you can do a senior discount because you can verify that they're over 55, or you can do a student discount because you can verify that they have a student ID, and you can verify the different time of day because you can look at a clock and say, oh, well, it's before noon, so you can get this deal, or it's a Tuesday, so you get a cheaper price at the movie theater. Now, in order for you to be able to discriminate in any sort of way, the first thing that you have to have is market power. So if you're in a perfectly competitive market, you can't do anything because of the fact that you're a price taker, not a price maker. So you can't even determine your price. So as a result, you can't charge a different price because you'll either go to selling the same amount as before or less because of costs, or selling nothing. The second thing is that different consumers have different willingnesses to pay, because if they're all willing to pay the same amount, there's really no incentive for you to be able to segment the market or charge different prices. And then last but not least, if you're doing like third order discrimination, you have to be able to segment the market so there can't be arbitrage. So like for a senior discount, you can't have a situation where the senior buys the ticket and then sells it to a kid or a regular adult. and then they basically take advantage of you trying to sell it to them, and then they make a profit, and you also lose out on revenue that you could have had if you were able to segment properly. So it's important to make sure that you can segment the market and make sure that people can't resell things into different markets. So like the international book market, they tried to segment the market. Then there was a Supreme Court case, I think in 2014, that basically said, yeah, international editions can be sold in America and there's no copyright claims that the publisher can make. So that segmentation was gone. So that's why you see a flood of international editions on like Amazon or like other book sharing, book rental, book purchase, used books purchases for textbooks. So that's price discrimination. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Otherwise, best of luck with your final assignments, and good luck on the final.